George and Matilda Mouse and the Floating School by Heather S. Buchanan. There was once a magnificent doll's house. It was tucked away in a dark corner of an old town garden. Inside lived a family of 7 mice, George and Matilda Mouse and their 5 children, Parsley, Mallow, Periwinkle, Columbine, and Polyanthus. They were a cheerful, busy family who worked and played by night and slept by day. The little mouse were often very noisy, but inside the doll's house, with its glass windows and tin door, they were safe from the cat, even when it could hear them squeaking. But Matilda Mouse was worried. She wanted her children to play with other little mice. More than anything, she wanted them to go to school. She played blind man's buff and tig with them whenever she could, and tried to teach them to read, but it was not the same as being in a proper school. Suddenly Matilda knew what she must do. She would start her own school. But a school needed pupils. A very old mouse called Fergus, who lived nearby in a gardener's boot, had once told George and Matilda about the rockery mice. They lived under the rocks by a pond in the middle of the garden. That night, George and Matilda left their children with Fergus and set out to find the rockery mice. Inside the mouse house, a ladder of twigs led down into a light and wonderful burrow. There, Matilda invited the little rockery mice to come and learn their lessons with her own children in her new doll's house school. The rockery mice were kind and clever garden mice. They already knew all the names and uses of plants in the garden, but they quickly agreed that school would be an excellent idea for their little mice. Lobelia, a grandmother mouse, promised to bring the first pupils the very next night. The moon was shining brightly as Lobelia and a long line of little mice set out across the slippery rocks beside the pond on the journey to school. All went well until Dandelion took an unwise leap over 2 rocks at once and fell paws over tail into the pond. He splashed and squeaked frantically, terrified of the goldfish who lurked in the weeds. Then Lobelia lowered Lavender on her walking stick, and she reached out and grabbed Dandelion just before the goldfish got him. Back on the rock, Lobelia hugged him better and wrapped him warmly in her shawl. It was a bedraggled little group that eventually knocked on the doll's house door. Matilda began lessons in the nursery. She used the doll's counting frame to teach sums, but the rockery mice were much more interested in the doll's toys. Soon these were all over the floor. Matilda decided to try cookery instead. She took the little mice down to the kitchen where George was in charge of lessons, but he couldn't find enough pots and pans for each mouse, so he started an art lesson. The little mice loved it. They did bubble painting and paw printing using berry jam. When Matilda returned, she found George looking very hot and bothered, and all the mice covered in jam. George also taught the little mice to read using scraps of paper that he collected from the dustbins. Soon they knew all the words on the labels of baked bean tins, crisps packet, and sweet wrappers. They learned their letters from newspaper that had been wrapped around fish and chips. Matilda was now happy again and pleased with her school, but George thought the mice should learn more about the plants, flowers, and insects outside. Helped by the older mice, he built a twig shelter beside the doll's house where they could have nature study lessons. When ladybirds came in, the mice did sums by counting their spots. But when the ladybirds got hungry, they would wander off to find new leaves to eat, and then the sums were all wrong. Sometimes a group of friendly worms appeared and curved themselves into letter shapes so the mice could practice their writing. And once a spider showed them how to weave a web, but when the little mice tried to copy it with cotton thread, they got terribly tangled up. During lessons in the shelter, the mice were always very quiet in case the cat should hear them. But one day Bramble got up during a nature lesson and sang a song he had made up about a bee. It was such a lovely song that Matilda didn't like to stop him, but as his little voice rose higher and higher, what she had always dreaded happened. With a crash and a growl, the cat was among them. The terrified mice scurried away in all directions, but poor Bramble was caught. Matilda and Fergus hid nearby, staring in horror. George grabbed a stick. "Pull Bramble away at the first chance," he whispered to Matilda. She nodded, trembling. "Oh, do be careful," she squeaked. George puffed up his chest and rode out in front of the cat, brandishing his stick and squeaking loudly. It had the right effect. The cat's eyes turned on him. With a snarl, she sprang forward, releasing Bramble. As George danced and dived about in front of the furious cat, Matilda crept out of her hiding place. Then George hit the cat's whiskers with his stick. Spitting and yowling, the cat pounced. Matilda rushed forward and dragged Bramble away. But George had tripped and dropped his stick. The cat's claw caught his stripy suit and flicked him in the air. George caught a glimpse of a snapping yellow teeth as he fell, bruised and exhausted, into a bush. He couldn't hear the cat now, but he knew she was still crouched in the bushes waiting for him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a familiar sight: the dustbin. Gathering all his strength, George made a dash for it, but the cat was already there. Now she fancied a game. She chased poor George around and around the dustbin. Then, for fun, she jumped up on top of it to dive down on him. But the dustbin lid wasn't fixed on tightly. As the cat sprang up, it tipped, and the whole bin crashed down. The noise brought the cat's owner to the kitchen door, and she was told crossly to go inside. George lay safe, but shaking with fright under the dustbin lid. His body was aching with pain from his bruises. But even as he lay there, a smile spread slowly across his battered face, for out of the dustbin had tumbled something truly wonderful. Let's see what it is. When George felt stronger, he made his way cautiously back along the flower bed to the doll's house. Long before he got there, however, he heard familiar squeaks, and through the ivy rushed his anxious family. They greeted him with tears of joy and relief. Matilda hugged George and then led him to see poor Bramble, who had now recovered a little from his terrible experience. He was in the nursery sipping tea while Lobelia fussed round, bandaging his cuts. For Matilda, the nightmare was not yet over. When she was alone again with George, there was a knock at the door. Outside was a small group of the older rockery mice. News of the disaster had reached their parents, and the little mice had been forbidden to return to school. The journey would be too dangerous now the cat knew what they were doing. Matilda wept. The school would have to close. To Matilda's surprise, George said nothing. He just smiled mysteriously, handed some strong rope to the rockery mice, and told them all to follow him. When they got to the dustbin, George pushed aside some apple peelings, lifted up a paper bag, and stood back proudly to show Matilda his find. "It's a new school," he announced happily, "a floating school." At dawn, the mice worked hard to drag the toy Noah's Ark to the pond and anchor it securely. They set to make paddles and seats for the inside. They painted pictures for the walls and packed food into the cupboards. There was a peg for each little mouse to hang up its life jacket and lockers for their pens and papers. When the floating school was ready, the proud mice rowed it across the pond to show their parents and collect the pupils for the first lessons aboard the Ark. For George and Matilda, it was a dream come true. Now the mice could add pond life to their list of things to study, and Fergus promised to start swimming lessons. But best of all, the cat never interrupted them again, because of course cats hate getting their paws wet. The end.